The square root property can be used to solve a quadratic equation. Before we talk about that, let me remind you of how we solved a quadratic equation by factoring. So we have this quadratic equation right here, x squared minus 16 equals 0. And if it equals 0, right, smiley face, then you can factor. This is the difference of two squares. We set both of our factors equal to 0, we solve for our factors, and we get our two answers. But there's another way to do it which can be helpful, and another way that we can use when factoring is not available, and it's called the square root property. And if you look right here in the middle, I'm going to show you this one using the square root property. So instead of getting it equal to 0, we need to get this square by itself. And in order to get the square by itself, we need to add the 16 to both sides. And now, x squared on the left equals 16. So once you have the square by itself, what you can do is you can take the square root of both sides.
Plus or minus.
That's right, boys. Plus or minus. Because when you take the square root of both sides, you have to make sure that you're taking the positive and the negative parts of that square root. Okay, and let's see it. So on the left-hand side, the square root of x squared is x. And on the right-hand side, we have plus or minus the square root of 16, which is 4. So that's actually two answers. It's the positive 4 and the negative 4. Okay, we don't need to write this plus right there. Now, notice that I get exactly the same answers. And why did we do plus or minus? Boys?
Plus or minus.
That's right. Because if we didn't, you see what we would have is we'd only have the 4. But you know that there's two possible answers. So every time you take a square root, you must
Plus or minus.
That's right. Now let's see an example where we're going to use the square root property where you can't factor. Look at this one. I can't factor that. It's not the difference of two squares. So you just wouldn't be able to do it using factoring. But using the square root property, we can get an answer. So first thing to do is to add the 50 to both sides so that we'll get our square by itself. Then we're going to have, drop down the equals, we'll have our x squared on the left because these cancel. And on the right-hand side, we have 50. So to get our x by itself, we are going to take the square root of both sides.
Plus or minus.
That's right, boys. Square root of both sides plus or minus. Now on the left-hand side, the square root of x squared is just x. And on the right-hand side, we have plus or minus the square root of 50. So these are real numbers. Square root of 50 is a real number. Positive square root of 50, negative square root of 50. And of course, we don't want to leave our answer like this because we can simplify. When you simplify a radical, you find a square root that goes into 50, which is 25. And 50 is 25 times 2. Square root of 25 is 5. So our answer is 5 square root of 2, the positive version and the negative version. So when I go to put my answer, I'm going to put the positive version, 5 square root of 2, and I'm going to put the negative version, negative 5 square root of 2. Okay, so using the square root property, first, you need to get your square by itself. Second, you need to do the square root of both sides.
Plus or minus.
Plus or minus. And then you go ahead and you solve and you get your answers.